the project to manifest yourself, the hashtag manifest, but the self-disclosure, is one that is, commissioned by, ordained by the data companies, right? Because if all of us feel like yet another selfie is the self-expressive, radical thing to do, and the more nude it is, the more transgressive it is, and so on, it's also that more imprints and more impressions are the model that the data companies use for deriving value. That kind of total congruence between our logics of, oh, it's radical if I express myself and take selfies, and I'm transgressive if I tell you my private truths, right, and my traumas. That congruence between that and data capture, it's a too closeness that means that the traditional possibility for art to shed some light on the economy instead of just reproducing the economy is being lost.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Today, we're going to be doing, as we like to do, I guess, some periodization. And joining me to do this is Anna Kornbluh, who teaches theory and literature at the English department at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and she's a member of the United Faculty Bargaining Team there. Anna, hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, so I'm excited to be talking about your book, Immediacy, or the Style of Too Late Capitalism, which has been recommended to me by a number of kind of listeners and friends, insisting that I read it and then eventually, have you on the podcast. So I'm happy to be finally doing this, even though the book came out about a year ago or so, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So, as my reading of it is that the book quite ambitiously seeks to depict the style of our era and to critique it in the name of perhaps reason over affect, collectivity over individualism, fiction over memoir, and there might be some other kind of oppositions that we can work through as we go through this. And of course, there's a very obvious, self-evident reference to Jameson's famous work on postmodernism, and we'll also, I think, come to that and try to get an understanding from you how your book relates to that or tries to build on that or indeed distinguish itself from Jameson's work. So to get started, what is immediacy? I mean, everybody knows what it is to be immediate. We're here speaking to each other, kind of separated by, probably some 10,000 kilometers. And so we're very much kind of mediated. But as you note throughout the book, sometimes certain things seek to replicate a certain sort of intimacy and an immediacy of Zoom calls, for example. So various different kind of associations one can make. Maybe if you could talk us through the definition very briefly.
Sure. So immediacy, I do mean it almost literally that it's the negation of mediacy. It's the cutting out of mediation. Mediation is a really important concept in the history of philosophy, but especially for Marxist philosophers and Marxist interpreters of culture. And it tends to mean putting into medium. It tends to mean the meaning-making activities that we do in everyday life, the social process of relating by putting things into language or art. So making ideas that can be commonly communicated and commonly held. And so if you're cutting out those meanings or you're cutting out those process, if you're short-circuiting those things, you end up with a kind of almost knowledge or epistemology framework of instant transmission, right? You know what I mean. I don't even have to say it. Direct message, right? What, kind of one-to-one relay, total mirroring. I feel seen. And that cutting out process, which goes along with a culture of speed, of kind of cutting out time lags and temporal delay, and is given to us by an economy of instant gratification, of instant transfer, direct access, on demand, and so on. Is a whole kind of style of ways of knowing, of ways of moving, of ways of receiving information and ways of receiving goods, especially, that also gives birth to this kind of aesthetic style where we have an impatience with the kinds of art that might require us to spend time getting the message. And instead, we want to have this instant, rapid uptake kind of scroll culture approach to being sure that we've got it. So the effort in the book is to kind of link that style as like almost a philosophy of existence and a philosophy of art, a demand about art, as well as a kind of imperative that art producers feel to link that style to the economic base for it in what I call the intensivity of circulation. So the correlation there in a kind of Marxist method where you think that there are transformations in the base that give rise to or sort of over-determine various transformations in the culture. The transition there would be to think about stagnating production. So declining wages, but also, as the labor side, but a real kind of lack of investment in production, the corporate stock buybacks and under rate of development of, microchip advances and so on. Think about that stagnation that has been experienced across the G7 economies since the 1970s as begetting, instead of a productive trend, a circulatory trend, since production and circulation are kind of two kinds of the value process. So there's making things and then there's exchanging them. And if you have a crisis of making things, both you have certain kinds of automation that mean that you don't need as many workers to make things, or you have a certain kind of saturation of consumption that means that people don't need as much stuff in a world market, that instead you can sort of speed up, or you can squeeze value out of speeding up how fast you get stuff to people. So same day shipping and streaming services and on-demand content and things like that. So the book is just doing that work of trying to say there are these economic transformations that bring circulation forward, and then we get these style transformations that are about express circulation.
Right. I mean, there's a lot there. Obviously, this touches on various different areas of life, or you identify immediacy and its causes in various areas of life. At a superficial level, I guess it's kind of vibesy. Lots of people talking about vibe and vibe
Right.
shift. You had in the US a vibes-based election, at least according to some.
Right.
And I know in a piece for Spike Art magazine, friends of ours, you kind of lean into this aspect of the kind of vibesiness.
Right.
The immediacy is kind of a vibe, but a vibe something inexplicable, and therefore itself is kind of immediate. So there's a kind of an automatic suggestion, I think, or a suggestion of a sort of correlation between vibe and immediacy. And maybe we'll kind of work through these from the kind of cultural levels down a little bit more deeply.
Yeah.
But maybe before that, when did immediacy begin as a going concern, or at least as the kind of dominant register through which culture expresses itself?
Yeah, so that's the hard periodizing question, right? So in 2015 or so, Frederic Jameson himself said in an interview in Social Text that it was evident that we were no longer in postmodernism. And there have been a number of hypotheses in the 21st century about what comes after postmodernism. Is it post-postmodernism? Is it new sincerity? And one of the ways that people tend to answer that, if they have the sense that things are actually a little bit different, postmodernism is so much about irony, but there seems in 21st century culture to be so much sincerity and authenticity, for instance, as one example of a difference, then what causes it? And one of the main academic answers to what might cause that is the real kind of digital revolution, so-called, so that you would pinpoint immediacy as starting around the turn of the millennium, right? That when we have the kind of explosion of platform capitalism and the data industries, that's when we have a kind of shift in culture. The problem with that explanation, I think, sometimes it's called the new media hypothesis, that like art looks different when we have a different technological basis for it, is that it doesn't fully kind of explain the broader macro context that helps bring about these particular technologies and helps elevate these particular technologies and particular technological ways of doing business. And again, that context is this kind of crisis of stagnation. So one of the tricks in the book about answering that when question is that on the one hand, things are different. Art looks different in the 21st century. 21st century studio art, 21st century literature, it's not doing the things that Jameson identified postmodernism doing in the 1980s. But on the other hand, things are still the same, right? We're still in this stagnation crisis. Something is the same, although something is different. That's the kind of dialectical problem the book is interested in. And one way of answering it is to say stagnation as a crisis starts in 1970s, and 1973 is kind of the famous origin for a lot of it for various reasons. End of the gold standard and certain labor agreements and so on, trade agreements. But when do you have kind of ambient consciousness of stagnation? When do people know that capitalism is in kind of crisis mode? When do even business leaders, not just Marxists, but like Larry Summers himself talks about secular stagnation. You can't get a more kind of official state economist than him, basically, right? That there's a kind of point when the decades-long declining rate of profit and the decades-long kind of search for other ways to squeeze profit out of the process comes into kind of consciousness, or comes into kind of fruition as like, oh, this is really where we're stuck right now. And I think that is, properly placed around the 21st century turn.
Yeah, no, I find that very interesting. I also suspect I would place it sometime around 2013 or something like that,
right.
When there's consciousness. But maybe that also itself has a class basis. There's a kind of maybe a professional class consciousness of decline and squeeze, which is more expressed then, whereas for a lot of kind of particularly industrial workers, that came almost a generation earlier. But anyway, we can maybe return to that in a bit, because maybe we wanted to talk about some cultural products specifically to try to work with some examples.
Okay.
So one example, Fleabag, a show that was on BBC. People probably saw it. I think it ran for 2 seasons. In it, the protagonist, a partly fictionalized version of the series creator, Sophie Waller-Bridge, frequently turns to the camera and addresses us, the audience. As you note, this takes the camera as a prosthetic of intimacy, which ends up reifying banal social isolation. You comment, why make the effort, you ask, to relate to the real other beside you when you can so seamlessly orate to the imaginary other in the screen, much as I'm doing now, except it's not an imaginary other, you're a real person. But, that I think sums up the experience of many, no doubt, in kind of dealing with screens as at the expense of people who are there in a real life situation, grabbing your phone at the dinner table, for example. So how is this an example of immediacy, first of all?
Sure. Okay. So Fleabag, really interestingly, is the first original show that Amazon makes for streaming, right? So Amazon is a distribution company or circulation company, right? They deliver stuff, but they have a point of figuring out that it's actually profit productive for them to cut out the middleman of the producer of the stuff they're delivering, right? And start themselves making stuff. So they commission the production of Fleabag, the television series, to be distributed on their streaming platform. And they do that on the basis, of this one-woman play, which is already in this kind of tendency that I'm interested in, of the kind of stripped away layers of representation, where you have the autofictional black box, monologic, no other actors, they're cheap to put on. They give you this kind of the confessional mode of theater, right? And so that's some of the important, as it were, industrial context for Fleabag. And then what does Fleabag do? Within the first scene, it's using this direct gaze, front-facing cinematography to make eye contact with and to DM the spectator, the reader, right? And that technique has long been identified as one which is kind of disruptive and which calls our attention to the layers of mediation. Brecht called it bearing the device, right? That if we break the fourth wall, if we make contact with the audience, that we're somehow calling their attention to the spectacle that they're a part of. But the industry refers to the fact that we watch streaming shows on our phones, which are the same devices that we also FaceTime our family members and, order our DoorDash and Uber Eats and stuff like that. They refer to that as device integration. that we do everything in our hand. And I think Fleabag's form of addressing us directly doesn't have the effect that device bearing had of sort of estranging us or making us think through the mediations. I think it has the effect of sort of luring us in, of integrating us into this notion of seamless, streaming, affective intensity and exchange with her. And so that the illusion, as it were, propagated by watching this show is that we are in relation when we are indeed not in relation. And the whole kind of rhetoric of abjection and of self-debasement and self-incrimination that the show, propagates in its Catholic frame and otherwise, really redound to this kind of effort to get at the viscerally affecting stuff, like this right here, right now intensity of connection that the direct eye contact seems to also be invested in. So to me, that's the fact that the show is so successful is one that requires explanation and requires kind of tethering what these grammars of direct access and of affective disclosure are related to in our broader social and economic context.
Okay, so spelling this out a little bit more, there's other maybe touchstones that we could, kind of cultural touchstones that we could refer to. I mean, there's this whole bit which I think is very good, but I don't want to dwell on it, on the kind of what you call the colonoscopic, which is portrayed in Uncut Gems, the Safdie brothers film, which is great. There's a great segment on that in the book. But I think for me, one of the most evocative chapters in the book is called Writing, very simply. And you trace various phenomena, one of which is the decline of third-person narration and turn towards first-person narration. So how is this a phenomenon of immediacy?
Yeah. So my main area of expertise is the history of the novel. I also have a degree in film, but the main thing that I teach and write books about is the history of the novel. And the novel is an interesting object because it's relatively young, right? Human beings have written poetry forever, but they've only written a novel for a few hundred years. And why is that? And one of the big scholarly answers that we give to where did the novel come from is capitalism. So the novel in the English tradition is composed in the third person. The majority of the novel is composed in the third person for hundreds of years. And there are digital humanists who have calculated the proof of this. And I have some graphs in the book of this, right? So even though there are plenty of great novels in the first person, it is sort of definitional to novel as a mode of consciousness, as a mode of engaging with the problem of capitalism, that it's often in some kind of collective voice or some kind of consciousness of ideology or, kind of both of those at the same time, right? The third person is not how we get to think when we walk around in our everyday life. And so third person is somehow kind of definitional for the novel, this amazing, weird layer of thought that we don't get to have phenomenally. I noticed, and this is one of the origins of the book, that in the 21st century, the best-selling books, the prize-winning books, and almost any book I could pick up anywhere at the bookstore were no longer being written in a third person. And it was very striking to me. How can we just have a certain kind of mutation in how this form has functioned for hundreds of years? And what's causing it? And if we think about the novel as correlated to capitalism, can you correlate this mutation to a change in capitalism is one of the questions. So if you don't have third person, if you have a dominance of first person, which indeed I also get these computational analysts to prove for me in the book, even though that's not exactly the point. But if you have a just supervailing dominance of the first person, that's a major mutation in how an art form works in the 21st century. What explanations can there be for that? I think that's a critic's job to start to provide some of those. And so it's not just that books are sort of written in a way that attenuates their fictionality because this first person is more similar to our lived phenomenal consciousness, but also that you find in the contemporary novel a lot of kind of foreshortened time horizons, a lack of plot, a lack of character, a disinterest in metaphor. There are a bunch of other aesthetic features that kind of go with this. But what I end up sort of thinking about it as is really a attenuation of fictionality, an anti-fictional impulse. And so these people who've been really heralded as avant-garde innovators in novel form in the 21st century, the autofictionalists, are very explicit about it being, quote, the duty of literature to fight fiction, as Knausgaard says, or Rachel Cusk has similar things. There's many other authors sort of take up this duty, this pursuit of the real that is explicitly against fictional making. And again, I'm interested in what is this suspicion of production, this suspicion of making, and this premium on intensity and real connection, and the kind of evanescent, shimmering, charisma of the authorial voice rather than a character's kind of voice. So I think about that in the novel, and I connect that to shifting labor conditions in journalism, shifting labor conditions in the academy, where we also see things like the rise of the personal essay, which displaces research-based journalism or actual reporting and even editing, or the kind of rise of creative nonfiction in the academy, or certain kinds of pedagogical transitions about helping students find their voice as opposed to teaching them content, right? And so to just think about that kind of expanded field of writing where the pressures are towards this demediated or kind of, as it were, privatized, sort of turn to an omnigeneric creative nonfiction in which we express ourselves. I talk about things like how memoir sales have increased 800% in the 21st century as something else that's, an explanatory factor or kind of putting pressure on the novel. But this kind of just undoing of novelness is one of those instances of immediacy, of taking apart the mediations that I'm trying to study.
Yeah, I mean, I had encountered the empirical case that's made about the decline of third-person narration in favor of first-person narration, and I think also, and I'm sure listeners have also encountered kind of the focus on and the turn to memoir, confessional writing, just way more I sentences in kind of public writing in general. But it's interesting to see these tied together and kind of put into this package of immediacy. One of the things that we've discussed, I think, on this podcast before is something that, I call, I don't know if this is even a good term for it, but I call illiterate literalism, which is a phenomenon amongst audiences of being unable to distinguish representation from reality, reported speech from direct speech, for example, and so on. To say, like, well, this thing's on the screen and this thing I find offensive, therefore it's wrong, and not being able to understand that as being itself kind of mediated. Do you see that itself as a phenomenon of immediacy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great term. And you're trying to put a name on this problem of, we have a cultural intolerance for representation. It's not just that artists think it's their duty to fight fiction. It's also that the consumers of cultural aesthetics have this demand that the work be instantly graspable, that it be accessible, that it be relatable. And that demand propels these kind of confusions, as you nicely note, where we say things like, I don't like the TV show Succession because those are bad people, and there's a TV show about bad people. Or I don't want to read, fiction about the past, when there were worse structures of social inequality, because that is what it is, right? This kind of self-identical flattening of things to a kind of political determinant, or the expectation that there not be any aesthetic dimension or distortion or metaphors, and that things just be in this literal vein of like, here's good values and good people, and we're going to give that to you, and watching them will make you good. But if we have bad values and bad people, then watching them will make you bad, or watching them as condoning their badness, like that the art object can't somehow give you a complicated perspective or a new way of thinking, and also a slow way of thinking, or one that doesn't totally translate into moral judgment even, right? Or maybe even value judgment. That is all what I see as sort of emptied out or under attack in our culture. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and one of the ways that you talk about this way of kind of putting everything on show in an immediate sense is that it's no representation, only present, right? Everything's on show. And made me think that, well, I guess, is this a way of saying that basically the map and the terrain is identical? Nothing is allowed to be reduced or synthesized. Everything needs to be presented as is. So it's only one-to-one kind of models. There, you can't have a map. It's just the terrain itself. And this presents itself as being against abstraction. I mean, there's a passage where you talk about, abstracting from something. And in fact, it struck me that it's not against abstraction. In fact, the presentation of things kind of in their immediate sense is itself abstract, because it's to show things is to abstract from these from presenting things in their social totality. Right. So to, kind of a book just on its own is an abstract kind of thing. It's actually only when you connect it to literature, to production, to paper, to all the rest of it, that it becomes kind of actually concrete.
Yeah. So, okay, this is such a hard problem, right? So abstract and concrete. And I think that immediacy is a kind of dominance of, or tyranny even of the concretude. But when you call it those things abstract, like that these concretudes are removed from their cultural context, or say, you have a book by a white man about his navel gazing experience and no other characters and no plot, and it's kind of inattentive to the field of relations, right? But somehow he's charismatic, and so that's globally best-selling. That form of concretude you're calling abstract, I think, because it's reified, right? It's what I would think of as a bad abstraction, right? Atomized or removed from context, this kind of self-identical plenitude that is standing alone, removed from relations. But I do think that it's really important that there are such things as good abstractions, and that good abstractions help us take in the context. Good abstractions are kinds of perspectives that allow us to theorize reification as an economic and social process. And one of my broader complaints in the book is definitely that there are academic tendencies to be unable to perceive the difference between good and bad abstraction, and to reject abstraction as inherently bad, when there are some real epistemological and political benefits to being able to think abstractly.
Well, I mean, and in fact, as I think this discussion hints at, it's the flight from abstraction which lands a lot of the immediacy people back in abstraction, of thinking of just this isolated individual and their own thoughts as if they exist as a sort of atom.
Yeah.
Maybe perhaps connected to this, and listeners will probably be like, listen, this is a politics podcast. Can we get to the politics? We're going to return to some of these cultural elements, but you do have a chapter which deals, or sections in one of the latter chapters, which deals more specifically with politics, and specifically anti-politics, which is a term long-term listeners will know is very dear to this podcast. And it's something which can be conceived in different ways, and I'm curious how you understand it. So I think it can be conceived in three different ways. One, people use it commonly to mean kind of withdrawal or depoliticization. Anti-politics means I'm not interested in politics. The other is as a kind of top-down strategy of depoliticization or foreclosure of contestation, post-politics, which I think is a better term for it. And then the final one, which is closer, I think, to my take on what anti-politics is, would be an angry rejection of the political establishment, but one that ends up dismissing the possibility of all representation, right? All politics, all politicians, all parties are kind of ontologically crooked, corrupt. It's a rejection of all mediation. It seems to me that that's what you're getting at, and trying to tie or bring in this lens of immediacy and then applying it to politics.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really wonderfully framed intervention. I think that all of those three senses are all important to me, and they're all operative in our context, right? The top-down authoritarian eclipse of politics, right? Or certainly eclipse of contestation, right? And just the kind of emanation of strong power. But the bottom-up kind of disinterest, right? In the United States political election, for instance, more people did not vote than voted for either of the candidates. Right. That is a real level of disengagement. Some of that is disenfranchisement, but most of it is not disenfranchisement. But this middle level where you have informed people who do want to be interested in politics, whether they are activists of various stripes or whether they are passionate onliners or whether they are intellectuals, but who think that there is something irredeemably illegitimate about formalized politics in the, sort of métier of the party or of the union or of the organization or of any kind of structured collective body as such, right? Because this is just oppressive to our spontaneity and oppressive to our individuality. Whether they come by that opinion as the kind of cynicism that you're probably describing, or come by it intellectually as a kind of, well, the history of our institutions is that they've always been terrible, or the institution doesn't love you back, or these kind of maxims of elite capture, I think, that are really about an allergy to thinking the possibility of contingency within institutions and organizations, and about an allergy to the obligation to do the work to make those vehicles of collective sovereignty. And I think at a certain point it becomes anti-politics in this way, a nihilistic, a love of losing, because there's an unwillingness to ever think about the messy meantime work of building power, and that winning politically or politics as such is not just about being right, but it is about collective power building. But power is even a dirty word for so many in this third wing of anti-politics.
Yeah, I mean, the anarchistic sort of bias which runs through a lot of politics, particularly on the left, but probably more beyond that, it's something that, you actually name it, and you make reference. I think you do use the word kind of anarchism once or twice in the book. Another kind of perhaps related word is nihilism, which you deal with in your discussion of what you call anti-theory. And so tying these together, you note that anti-politics renounces the mediation of organization, anti-theory renounces the mediation of theory, and immediacy autonomizes. So maybe you could unpack it for us.
Yeah, totally. So if anti-politics, again, might be earned as in this activist register often, and in the, as you say, potentially anarchic tendencies of certain left activist domains. I call that, in the book I wrote before this, The Order of Forms, I call it anarcho-vitalism. But there is also, again, a theoretical sort of basis for these convictions, one which in the realm of ideas and the realm of theory making, I am exposed to a whole lot of by my fellow intellectuals, right? Which is undialectical negativity, this romance of the negative, this sense that the only freedom is in formlessness, that the only telos of institutions is to dominate, that our history, instead of being the history of people struggling, is the history of successful domination, and that's the way that you have to tell it. And conceptually, or anti-conceptually, as the case may be, what this is starting to look like to me is, just such profound suspicion of the idea that there could ever be adequate representation, adequate mediation, adequate commonly held meanings, right? Things that we could agree to so that we could further our collective projects, that you find instead theorists engaging in a real both attack on any kind of collective formalized symbolic meaning, and that meaning as such is suspicious, right? And also turning instead to this kind of self-emanation and self-evanescence. So we find quite laureled tenured theorists, writing memoirs about how they masturbate while they have cancer as their scholarly output, rather than the construction of concepts that are common to us. Not that there aren't plenty of people who have cancer, not that there aren't plenty of people who masturbate, but that this impulse to self-objectifying disclosure and personal testimony that we see across studio art and streaming television and fiction, we also see in contemporary intellectual production. And it is presenting itself as more legitimate than other kinds of theoretical genres, other kinds of theoretical endeavors, because it doesn't profess to represent, it doesn't profess to make an idea of purchase or use to other people. It's now, I am writing about myself, and now it is your turn.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm going to jump ahead actually to something, because it's already been suggested by something you've just mentioned. So isn't this better understood simply as a continuation of the breakdown of public and private distinctions? So, one example, I don't know if this was the reference you were making, but Mackenzie Wark's book called Reverse Cowgirl, which you cite in the book, in your book, contains an invitation to masturbate with a copy of her book, which is a complete kind of breakdown of registers, of conventions. To me, that sounds like a misguided response to privatization, political, cultural, kind of philosophical, and in various kind of different senses that is going on today, and that the response to that privatization is to explode the private onto the world. No pun intended, hopefully, but to make everything kind of visible. And so, why immediacy, and why not talk about it simply in terms of public and private?
Oh, yeah, that's also a great question. So you're right that one of the ways of describing our age, and one of the ways of describing the response to production crisis and productive overcapacity and stagnation, is the turn to privatization, both the state subsuming itself to the interests of corporations, and the state selling off public resources for private operations, so that there can be some squeezing out of profit from other realms or other industries, right? And so what we have then, if that's an industrial configuration, an ideological configuration, then we get this aesthetic and cultural kind of ethos of just let me air my privates in all manners, right? That there's a certain kind of performance of the private that somehow corresponds to that. I think that's a very, very interesting. But I think that privatization is something like a positive formation atop the kind of emptying out crisis that I'm talking about. That the attack on representation, I think, symptomatically takes this form of personalization, like the first person in fiction, or confessional in anti-theory or something. But it doesn't inherently take that form. It also takes forms of just kind of like demediation, or like genre meld, like there's just things falling apart, there's kind of collapsing anti-structure. So like I talk a lot about the rise of dramedies in the streaming chapter, for instance, or if you think about studio artists who now like would never talk about their work, they just describe my practice, and they would never want to belong to a medium or a genre. They would want to be omni-genre and multimedia all the time. That these are other kinds of manifestations of the style of a kind of crisis about mediation. That privatization is just kind of one of them, or personalization is just kind of one of them. I also think that the project to manifest yourself, the hashtag manifest, but the self-disclosure, is one that is, commissioned by, ordained by the data companies, right? Because if all of us feel like yet another selfie is the self-expressive radical thing to do, and the more nude it is, the more transgressive it is, and so on, it's also that more imprints and more impressions are the model that the data companies use for deriving value from their corner of the economy. And that kind of total congruence between our logics of, oh, it's radical if I express myself and take selfies, and I'm transgressive if I tell you my private truths, right, and my traumas. That congruence between that and data capture as one of our main like economic engines is it's a true closeness that means that the traditional possibility for art to shed some light on the economy instead of just reproducing the economy is being lost. And so that's the kind of falling away or the collapsing of the aesthetic mediation, of the putting things in the medium, that I'm really worried about. And so I would say that it's a kind of bigger problem than privatization, if that makes sense as an answer.
No, and I think that's one area where I find it very convincing, your attempt to connect the material base and these kind of cultural ideological changes, this kind of turn towards divulging everything inside, and the data economy, which seeks to capture all sorts of elements of subjectivity. So I think that's really neat and well put. Another neat and well put, and this is, I swear, this is the last bit I'm going to quote back to your books. I think that might be kind of obnoxious, which is all ends are bad. I mean, this is you portraying the problems and the nihilism of anti-theory. All ends are bad. All institutions are oppressive. Human history is only the history of domination. Values like freedom or responsibility are instruments of these forces of bad oppressive domination, and therefore the only minimally affirmable virtues are ephemerality, hybridity, destabilization, fugitivity. I think that's very good. I think that's a quite neat summation of the hole that we find ourselves in today. And you clearly want to rescue kind of forward motion, progress, dialectics. But then at the end, I mean, you repeatedly put things in terms of, or at least twice, of making things less worse. And I found that to be a bit of a concession to immediacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So things are very, very bad, but I'm trying to think about the ameliorative. Mediations, in that kind of classic civic sense, is like, oh, I'm getting a divorce, I have to go to mediation, or, oh, we have a conflict, we have to go to mediation, right? How do you kind of broker things non-juridically, but that improve the situation and are a meeting of both sides? And what I see as the value of the less worse is that it's a formulation that helps us think we are in catastrophic times, and we have even worse catastrophic calamities coming because they're already baked in, right? But you can't resign, and there isn't, a kind of perfect sphere of solution either. But there is remediation and amelioration. And I think that it's really important to be able to hold on to that middle ground as an ethical and political imperative, right? But partly because we see so many artists whose response to our omni crisis is precisely to do immediacy, is to say like, oh, what good is art? Who needs a metaphor? We can't, participate in these indirect, vague representations because they're distracting us from the emergency, right? And there are a lot of artists who are propagating this kind of anti-art thing as an ethical climate solution, right?
Yeah.
Only documentary, or, don't use metaphors in your poetry, or don't even write poetry, just write, like literally people, prophesying this all the time. And they are presenting this as climate righteous. And I'm just trying to suggest that there are actually tactical and strategic reasons why climate struggle requires intervening bodies and, say, central coordination of sorts, but also that art as intervening middle ground is possible still, that we shouldn't lay down the tools of collective meaning making when we have an obligation to try to prevent the worst, to make things less worse. We're not going to win climate utopia very, very soon. And really bad things are coming. They're here. But I don't see the point of nihilism about that, of resignation about that, of romantic, abdication or human abolitionism or so on about that.
No, certainly. I mean, I don't know what climate utopia would be, other than kind of what we have now, which seems pretty conducive to human civilization, albeit we probably don't have the upper hand on nature just yet. That would maybe be utopian. But to turn to the obvious reference of Frederic Jameson's 1984 article and his book from 1991, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. So I want to know how your book, how your work seeks to distinguish itself from Jameson's, and there's some obvious contrasts that we can draw. So you talk about a cultural style, where he talked about a cultural logic. You talk about too late capitalism, which I think is quite neat, versus late capitalism. And you talk about immediacy versus postmodernism and postmodernity. So how do you situate yourself with regard to Jameson? What's changed?
Yeah. So I think this kind of problem of circulation being the main source and disintermediation, which is what the kind of business calls circulation a lot of the time, being the main source of value, that the intensification of that problem is one of the changes. So Jameson starts writing in a situation of what he calls, and the geographer David Harvey calls, space-time compression, right? There are ways of thinking about postmodernism in relationship to globalization and the rise of multinational corporations and to certain kinds of global logistics systems, as providing this kind of coterminous experience that like all cultures are next to each other, and I can get goods from all over the world and get them pretty fast, and therefore I can sort of build buildings that have like ancient Greek columns and also shimmering titanium panels, and like the postmodern mishmash of style sort of reflects this sense of like the unification of the world market, right? Globalization as a moment. And I think what circulation intensification 40 years later looks like is this just planing away of representation, so that you don't retain the contours of heterogeneity where you have a Doric column and the titanium panel. It's instead that everything is sort of made out of adaptive fibers, that you can have the building be, available for multiple functions, or like the co-working space, or like the retractable roof, or that you have, materials that are actually pressed into the service of fluidity and multiplicity and kind of an emanative relation to any kind of function. For example, since architecture is very important to Jameson's analysis. So there's kind of difference between pastiche that has, or a collage that has different heterogeneous elements in it, and a certain kind of blurring that is really like more homogeneous and kind of like a sludge or a slurry. That's one of the kind of aesthetic contrasts I'm interested in. Postmodernism aesthetically is often about irony and kind of play, and immediacy to me is very often about seriousness, sincerity, authenticity, and humorlessness. There are, in postmodernism, partly related to the irony, there's a kind of sense, Jameson says that affect is kind of on the wane, like that there's a certain kind of flatness and a certain kind of multi-perspectivalism that is kind of maybe impersonal or kind of conceptual and not affected. Whereas I think immediacy is the domain of waxing affects and their kind of veritability, right? Everybody has their trauma, and their trauma is their truth, and everybody has to speak their truth. And the kind of verifiability and certifiability and unimpeachability, unassailability of the personal experience and the affective domain seems to be really, really important in there. So there's a series of kind of aesthetic ways that I try to contrast them, and kind of epistemological ways and philosophical ways. temporality is also one of them. For Jameson, late capitalism is a way of describing this multinational moment, even though late capitalism has been a term that had already been around for 60 years by the time he's starting to use it, right? And he's taking it from Ernst Mandel. To me, and postmodernism is described by this kind of temporal mixing, which comes with the mixing of goods on the market, right? So just like the Doric column with the titanium panel, that you can have this sort of like relationship to history, which is flattened and decontextualized, but has some acknowledgement of history. But he talks about it as a kind of loss of historicity. That everything is just available for consumption. There's a commodification of everything and integration of the world market. And so that the past becomes this kind of just wellspring of styles we can play with, but isn't like a materially relevant or politically relevant kind of process of contingent arrival at the stage of capitalism. It's just like, we're all here. And that functions as a kind of loss of history for him. And I'm really interested in a kind of other side of the temporal equation there, which is a loss of futurity that comes with our, again, baked in heat death and displacement of billions of people and so on, and also comes with just the reified, imminent, vibrating present, that this is all there is just the present. We don't have a past and we don't have a future.
I mean, didn't Jameson already incorporate the kind of the absence of futurity in his depiction of postmodernism? I mean, I can identify various sort of discontinuities and continuities with Jameson, what you're describing. And so, for example, the prevalence of meta or irony or breaking down the fourth wall, okay, that's typically postmodern. But, to go back to Fleabag, her turning to the camera itself is also a facet of that. So it seems to me that there's some of these things which are kind of continuous with postmodernism. Mm-hmm. There's others I definitely see them as discontinuous and kind of new. I mean, I had noted down, kind of was looking over my notes, that that immediacy does seem to be certainly post-ironic, and if not a turn to sincerity, because I'm not entirely sure that's the right term. And there's obviously this whole concept of the new sincerity, which is partly related to this, but certainly move away from irony and certain self-seriousness, if not seriousness itself.
Right. And also there's a dimensional thing there, right? So irony is always like a slippage of levels, right? It's like whatever the perspective is, but we can kind of undercut it. And I think that immediacy is too flat for that. Like it has this just planarity. It just has, that's what fluidity is as an economic imperative and as a style imperative. You get it. We're on the plane. I see you, like the seamless transmission. It doesn't allow for this kind of slippage or this metalepsis, it's called in some technical ways, but the change among levels. Everything is on the same level. But you're right to point out that many of the things that I describe could be seen as extremizations of the postmodern, right? Heterogeneity and pastiche. I'm really concerned about blur and indistinction and the kind of repudiation of conceptual specificity or the melding of all styles and all other two genres. That's, a form of all that is solid melts into air. And you can see heterogeneity or pastiche or that kind of mixing as a prelude to the sludge of indistinction, right? And again, the problem is something is the same and something is different. How do we describe these things? And I do think it is the task of critics to try to put concepts on and put names on some things that meaningfully distinguish themselves from other things. Like that, where I'm trying to give people language for thinking that we aren't exactly in the same postmodern aesthetic repertoire or even epistemic repertoire as we have been in, and that we're certainly not in the same economic situation. I also there are ways that I emulate the postmodernism book a lot, like having chapters that are about specific art media and so on. But I do try to be a lot more economically specific than Jameson is in postmodernism. And that was something that he was criticized for, sort of relying on a couple of geographers and historians and not having a kind of adequate enough account of what actually was different in the 1970s. And there's lots of really wonderful work inspired by him since then about what's actually different about deindustrialization and about NAFTA and about the kind of decline of union domains and so on. But I have a whole chapter in the book where I do try to, synthesize and describe crisis theory and the question of circulation and this kind of ways that people have made sense of whether the digital revolution is indeed contributing to rates of growth and the G7s and so on.
Right, very good. I want to turn to a kind of general theme that I've called alienation here. I'm not sure it entirely fits, but I do wonder, to what extent you understand alienation or rather immediacy in relation to alienation, whether it is a phenomenon of alienation, it's a kind of a tentative response to the feeling of alienation, or if indeed maybe alienation isn't relevant to this. And before getting to that kind of question directly, I wanted to ask about experience, because you tie memoirization and first-person narration to the mistrust of, quote, authority untethered from experience. But I wonder, what experience are we concerned with here, or what experience are those who create very immediatist works concerned with? Because it seems like, we can understand experience, or rather that experience itself has been reconfigured, not as something that might be a precursor to know-how, but understood in a much more objectified sense. Experience is stuff that happened to me, right? And not, I have experience, which is to say I did stuff, I was there, and I learned things, and therefore I am able to bring to bear my experience. So there's like a very different notion of agency in these different understandings of experience.
Yeah, that's well put. So I'm very concerned about the immanentization of experience, that there is a kind of corporeal profundity of the things that happen to me and my perspective on them, and an ability to unassailably authenticate my perspective on those embodied experiences as, the master source of any defensible knowledge project now. I wrote an essay while I was writing this book that I didn't include in the book, and I think that actually probably ended up a mistake. It was published in Diacritics. It's called In Defense of Feminist Abstraction, but it's trying to do a kind of genealogy of some of these ways of thinking about experience. But I do actually think that experience, in the sense of the more objective frame that you were referring to, of the knowledge that is made of what happens, and the drawing upon knowledge that other people have articulated, even if they're different from me, and even if their experience is different from me, and that tethering together, weaving together of knowledge into expertise is the thing that is a little bit collapsed or compromised here, when we just have this kind of emanative hashtag manifest notion that you live it and you know it. You do you, speak your truth. It is present to itself. It is immanent to itself, and you're the authority. And so I am worried about these features of our epistemic style that become, really influential politically when it comes to questions of coalition and being in community with one another and having common goals. The goals have to be an idea exterior to ourselves that we agree upon, and then we have tactics for, even if they differ from what has happened to me. So that is worrisome. Alienation, I think you could say that the liturgy of the profundity of lived experience right now is a kind of version of social alienation, even though it appears in the clothes of social identification, right? This is me, this is my identity, this is my group, and this is what we know. But it's often untethered from, untied to, unintegrated in, bigger frameworks that are the precondition for collective action and collective meaning. And so it's alienated, even though it presents itself as self-identified or authentic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, here I think it comes through the apologetic nature of immediacy, of the cultural works and political phenomena that you tag as immediate, or concerned with immediacy, or of this vibe. I don't know, which is that it, as you note at one point, it kind of ontologizes kind of impossibility, right? That we're kind of can't understand one another, that we're stuck in this political impasse, that domination is everywhere and total, that freedom is impossible, and indeed that we can't create any balance of solidarity because our experiences are entirely unique to ourselves. And in that regard, I think you do note somewhere that it's kind of continuous with so much bourgeois theory that basically says, well, look, this is how things have always been and will be forever, and you just
Right.
have to kind of lump it, even if it strikes a more tragic tone than affirmative. But I think the effect is the same, and I think that's neatly observed. With regard specifically to alienation,
Yeah.
I wonder, and maybe to kind of rephrase the question I was kind of driving at earlier, is some of it seems to me like, I want to share my feelings with you and have you observe them so you can recognize me. And that speaks to a kind of, I don't know, wounded form of subjectivity, and therefore is a kind of a response to alienation. On the other hand, often today we talk about the kind of atomized individual, and maybe atomized is no longer even the right term, because we're dealing with a much more disintegrated subject than one, or
Mhm.
fragmented than one, which is merely an atom separate from others. I think we're maybe perhaps already several generations away from like Guy Debord's concern with with the spectacle and our distance from it, because
Mhm.
it's so I don't know, how do you understand alienation? I don't think it's a term that comes up in the book, and I don't know if it's a
Right.
concern of yours.
I mean, so actually, there's a recent book by Todd McGowan called Embracing Alienation. I think that's what it's called. But certainly, that's some of the point that we've been sort of confused in thinking that the goal of politics or emancipatory movements, or of philosophy even, is to get over alienation. That there's like a
Mm,
dimension of alienation proper, which is not only constitutive of our being, as lacking incomplete, unself identical subjects who are not transparent to ourselves, but also constitutive of political and civilizational life. That, the point is not to find ourselves in a common whole that is united and everybody is the same. Right. The point is to have a framework that allows for differences without giving up on the character of universal lack or the character of universal differentiation, that paradoxically is a sameness. So I think that getting over alienation is like the wrong goal. And it's the romantic goal that's at stake in a bunch of the anti-political kind of nihilism that we were discussing, this kind of underside of this hopelessness that is romanticized as the only ethical posture is often this wish that there would be, some unity, some unimpeachable institution, so that we could stop
mm,
saying these things about institutions, or some, and every social formation will beget discontent, right? But we have to have enough collective power, collective sovereignty, that we can negotiate the discontent in a given regime and figure out if we want to try a different one. And if we only impugn the regimes, and if we only impugn vehicles of collective power, and if we only dissent from provisional symbolizations that can hold us together, like a we, then we don't have the ability to even engage in that fight of those deliberations. So I think if you think about, there was a really great article in Teen Vogue last week by the excellent philosopher who I write about in the book, Olufemi Taiwo, about the sort of difference between political movements that ask people to be something and political movements that ask people to do something. And
mm,
there's going to be alienation when you're asked to do something, but winning things together with people who are different from you is better than losing with people who are the same as you. And the kind of recipe for what you have to do every day when you're trying to do things and win things together versus when you're trying to be things are quite different, because one of them is about refining your sense of identity and discriminating against those who don't uphold it, right? And the other one is about having a broad vision that people have different on-ramps to and different reasons for, and that they can assent to, this is good enough for us to do together, and let's win it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, at some point, I think you tag immediacy or some kind of cultural product that you see as characteristic of immediacy as kind of oceanic feeling, in reference to Freud. And there's too much politics which tries to recreate the feeling of being in the womb or going back to the womb, and that's like as a political goal. And you're absolutely right that is that cannot be the object and the aim of politics. Now, I wondered how you would answer a critique. Now, this is put forward in a recent review of your book by the philosopher and Hegel scholar Jensen Souther in Non-Site, that immediacy isn't just a style that emerges at a certain stage of capitalist development, but is a socially necessary illusion or form of appearance characteristic of capitalism itself, capitalism tout court, not this phase after postmodernism or postmodernity. So one example would be that the laborer sees himself as an atomized individual confronted with an alien system, but in fact, this is exactly the form of appearance of actually a complex social formation and form of social organization. And actually, it's one in which the labor happens to be very powerful and not powerless, because he's the source of capital. So anyway, how would you answer this critique that immediacy is somehow is baked into the into bourgeois society?
Yeah, so I think there's also actually truly parallel idea that immediacy is always an art style, right? That ever since Plato, this is always both a promise and a threat of artworks. That there's nothing new here, or that both of those arguments sort of have in common the concern that it's not really possible to specify or to periodize like what is distinct about 21st century culture or what is distinct about the too late of a stagnation crisis, right? Is there some period that we are in that is specific or not? And I think that the point would be that, there are ideological formations which attend to capitalism. They have to go back to this, contradiction between abstract and concrete we were talking about. The kind of misperception of mediation as immediacy is endemic to capitalism, partly because the mechanism of capital as opposed to money is to tend towards immediation, right? Capital wants to disappear the mediators so that it can be self-begetting. That is the structural description of capitalism in many ways. It has a tendency to obviate mediations. However, the concern in the book, the analytical claim in the book, is that we are in a moment where our superstructural products, our studio artworks, our streaming television and video and film, our fiction, and our official ideas, our theories, are themselves so beholden to this economic tendency that they are emptying out their own imminently critical capacity, that they are that there is too much closeness between the economic determinants and art in a way that is historically specific, that art's traditional office of departure, of semi-autonomy, is what is degraded when immediacy is embraced as the technique of art and as the hegemonic goal of art. So it's an analytic claim about the convergence of circulation intensivity with, as it is borne out by the data companies in the 21st century, by platform capitalism in the 21st century, with our aesthetics, which isn't a claim that this aesthetic features have never existed before, have never been problematized before, or don't also have other moments of historical conjuncture in capitalism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I I follow that. I'm trying to kind of mediate these two things, to, not to put a kind of make a pun of it or something, but which is and to kind of continue with Suther's critique, if you don't mind me putting this to you, because I read it yesterday and I thought, okay, well, I need to take the opportunity to kind of bring these things together, which is that immediacy. I mean, as in his critique of your book, is that it's not a theoretical or a practical, voluntary thing, effectively like a bad choice, but it's somehow a socially necessary form, not just kind of within capitalism, that capitalism kind of brings forward a form of immediacy, or that's the necessary form that it takes, but also specifically that immediacy today is somehow socially necessary. And he kind of tries to run this through the relationship between kind of memoirization today and earlier forms. I mean, you mentioned Brecht earlier. We could bring in Beckett, perhaps, that trying to put this, talk about culture in cultural terms and not relate it so directly to kind of a material base.
Right. I mean, but that's the difference between somebody who identifies as a philosopher and somebody who identifies as a Marxist critic. That I do think that what my intellectual operation is to do dialectical criticism, not to do dialectical philosophy. That I do think that my intellectual operation is to relate the specificity of a conjuncture to its base. And he does not think that. I also think that when you're a philosopher, you might, although that's not what his PhD is, and I don't believe, right? But that's how he identifies. But when you're a philosopher, that you are interested in necessity as a feature of structure. But when you are a dialectical thinker, you are interested in contingency and necessity as they work together. Lukács says, works of art exist. How are they possible? Marx makes the critique of philosophy. He says the ruling ideas in every society are the ideas of the ruling class. He invents the theory as a kind of ability to reflect on the congruence between philosophy and the structure of power and forces of production in society at a given time, right? The job here is not to say in this book, all forms of immediacy forever are bad. And also, this form of immediacy has never existed before. Neither of those are the claims that the book makes, right? The book is interested in the periodizing problem of the convergence of a cultural aesthetic with an economic base. And there is specificity to that and contingency to that. These artists are choosing to renounce and attack and delegitimate mediation. That is a contingent choice, and artists could choose otherwise. And it's the job of the critic to help artists make other choices. And I do think that it is a sign of people being interested in the possibility of making other choices that so many art schools want to teach this book, and so many gallerists are interested in it. And I seem to be making, kind of some headway communicating with artists who want to work differently. That's what I think critics are supposed to do. And that's about keeping open the contingency side, not just the necessity side, which is another way of saying, I don't think he's good at Hegel.
All right. I'll perhaps let him respond at some future point in time. But I do think certainly the book is provocative in forcing us to think about these connections. I particularly think it's evocative in bringing together something which has been it suggested itself to me, which is precisely this confluence between the anti-representational thrust of a lot of contemporary politics and that very same thing in culture. And actually, the book has been very useful in for me at least, in thinking these things through, that there does seem to be a common immediacy going on there, both in politics and in culture. I wanted to make one final point of discussion, if you have a moment, which is, and please correct me if I've misunderstood the point you're making, but you're critical of the historical erosion of theory's conditions of production. So you refer to the precarization of academic labor, et cetera. I mean, people will be familiar, I think, with this sort of discussion. And I think you tie this to a problem of the inability of a class of professional intellectuals to reproduce itself. And I don't think that's cause for celebration, but are you not critical also of the professionalization of theory and of politics and philosophy within the academy? I mean, isn't that itself part of the problem, that to return to the 1960s or 1970s, that would be incorrect. It would be incorrect to read that as a kind of golden age of theory.
I am not critical of professionalization of philosophy and theory. I think that there are spaces for and uses for professionals, and there are uses for theory. I think that there have to be studied the interesting opportunities for that. What was it about the post-war expansion of the university in the United States, for instance, and about the social movements that coincided with it, and then that revolutionized the curricula in it, that enabled that to be possible, to think about this kind of as a space where there was some actual professional production of expert ideas that then could be of use for people doing things other than working in the university. I totally believe in that. I think that theory is a crucial mediator in that way, and that we should celebrate the spaces where institutions or professional practices or professional conditions of labor do make that possible. But that's not so much the case anymore. And you can argue that that partly has to do with the lack of class consciousness of the very people who are doing that work, if you want to. There's a lot of enthusiasm for sort of blaming the tenureds for the death of the university. I don't think that's exactly a good explanatory map. I think it's not, just as it's not right to blame taxi drivers for Uberization, it's not particularly right to blame the people who are doing the work for the massive and national structural transformations of their workplaces. But I do not disdain professional, expert, dedicated, resource-intensive production of theory. I don't. I think it's essential.
I mean, I certainly think there's the necessary kind of conditions for certain elements of research, certainly. But insofar as theory should be political, I'm skeptical about its academicization, and therefore disconnect from kind of immediate practice. I mean, I would see fundamentally the problem as being you can't make a living, pay the rent, and pay your expenses simply by writing. You have to either be in the academy or not be kind of writing and thinking at all. And then for me, that seems to me the deeper problem.
Right, but that's capitalism, right? You can almost not do it in anything other than working in a corporation for profit, right? It's very hard to make a living as an artist. It's very hard to make a living as a care worker. It's very hard to make a living doing anything attending to social reproduction or the flourishing of our species as creative and curious beings. Those are not the things that are valued in a capitalist economy. And I don't know that the theorists are any different from the artists or the care workers in that respect. We sometimes hold them to a standard that they're different because their particular work that they're involved in is supposed to give them perspective, right? And I am definitely holding them to a standard right now that they are renouncing perspective and that they are, renouncing understanding the convergence of their anti-theoretical ways with broader industrial forces. That they've, because they have actively repudiated the techniques of gaining that kind of perspective. But I'm not sure that it is a incrimination of theory as such that one can't do it without an institutional perch. I just think that's our capitalist predicament.
All right, very good. I think we'll leave that there. But thank you, Anna, so much. This has been great. I've hugely enjoyed discussing your very stimulating book with you.
Thanks so much for having me and for the questions and the time and the reading. I really, really appreciate it.